the 60s and the consciousness that was raised kind of in many ways did civilize the country with women's rights, equal rights, the student movement, the peace movement. Do you think these have kind of sunk in and rooted themselves in this new tent city? We know we've experienced, the prejudice, we know it still exists. Do you think, given the time that's elapsed and it's rooted, this movement, do you think this can resurge?
You never know. Nobody could have said in the early 60s that it was going to radically change the country, which it did.
So today is Super Tuesday, and the candidates will be campaigning around the slogan of jobs. Let's assume that 99% of climatologists are right in their studies that anthropogenic climate change exists, and that to varying degrees many of these jobs they're campaigning for would emit enough CO2 to permanently defile the biosphere. Let's say that you're campaigning advocating occupations and not jobs, and that every occupier is his or her own boss in a society structured on direct democracy, egalitarian principles. Talk about your understanding of work as it relates to human nature, liberty, education, creativity, spirit, and happiness.
Well, first of all, just to put to the side what ought to be a marginal question, the candidates are not struggling for jobs. Jobs in American speech has a new meaning. Jobs is the way you pronounce an obscene word, namely profits. You can't say profits, so nobody ever talks about that. What you say is jobs. That sounds better than profits, but it's profits. Like, not a single one of those guys cares one way or another about jobs. They've got different commitments. So let's put that aside. What about work? Well, we could think about this. There are very concrete questions, like, do we want higher employment right now within the existing system of production, or in fact the system of production has been substantially diminished and much of it sent overseas? Well, I think the answer is that it has to be modulated. There's nothing wrong with having a decent job, the kind of job you like and it's gives you a way to live and so on. Does it have to be a job that's contributing to the likely destruction of the possibility for decent survival, not too many years down the road? Well, it doesn't. There's plenty of jobs which would, in fact, of potential for employment, which would overcome or at least reduce the threats that you mentioned of anthropogenic global warming. Some of them pretty low tech. So take just say weatherizing houses. That's a lot of people could be put to work weatherizing houses. That would have a big effect. Take say the automobile industry, which was essentially nationalized for a time. Well, there were choices, and if the Occupy movement had been around and big enough, it might have influenced those choices. One choice was the one that was taken to reconstitute it with public funds and essentially return it to its former directions with pretty much the same sectors of the population running it, maybe a couple of new faces, but replacing them with similar ones. There were alternatives. For example, the quasi-nationalized industry could have been turned over to the stakeholders, the workforce and the community, who could run and manage it and use it to produce things that people really need and that in fact future generations need if they're going to be able to survive, like high-speed rail instead of transportation geared to the maximal use of fossil fuels, which is what's been going on for decades. So that could have been done. The skilled workforce out in the Rust Belt could do that quite well, maybe a little federal aid, but with the support of the public and with the right kind of consciousness. That is the kind that did exist in Spain in 1936 after decades of education and organizing. It didn't just come from nowhere. The belief that, yeah, we can run our own enterprises. And in fact, it didn't really die in Spain. So the biggest, by far, the biggest worker-owned conglomerate in the world is Mondragon, which includes production, banks, schools, hospitals, everything. It's worker-owned. In a limited way, it's worker-managed. There are professional managers, but in principle, they're supposed to come from the workforce itself, be selected out of it and responsive to it. How much that happens, it's a question. You have to look, but at least that's the idea. And it's an outgrowth of the kind of consciousness that did develop in Spain and led to the great anarchist revolution in 1936. But it takes time. Actually, this came from a liberal Catholic background, kind of like liberation theology, more or less. But it was fed into the other kind of left libertarian currents that were common. And that could have happened here, it still can. That would be a big change. And then if you go further to your general question, what's work? Well, there are fundamentally two different ways of looking at work. One is capitalist ideology. That basically takes for granted that the natural state of a person is to vegetate. You have to be driven to work. If you aren't driven to work, you'll lie around watching television or take your money from the welfare office, and you won't do anything. So therefore there have to be punishments for not working and rewards for working. That's essentially capitalist ethic. There's a different conception which goes right back to the Enlightenment, and that's one that regards work as one of the highest goals in life. But they're referring to a special kind of work, creative work, taking under your own control and under your own initiative. This was put rather graphically by one of the founders of classical liberalism, Wilhelm von Humboldt, also one of the major figures in developing the modern higher education system. The way he put it was, he said, if an artisan produces a work on command, a beautiful work, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is, namely basically a tool in somebody else's hand. On the other hand, if that same artisan, under his own control and initiative, creates a beautiful work, which is where the work is in fact satisfying to him because it can be the highest goal and one of the highest goals in life, well, we admire what he is as well as what he does. It's a very different conception of work. And it's a conception that's pretty familiar to all of us. I mean, if you just walk down the halls around here, you'll see people working maybe 80 hours a week, hard, because they like what they're doing. They're fundamentally controlling their own work, working on challenging issues. And you don't have to be an engineer and a scientist to do that. Same is true of carpenters, plumbers. I know just plain artisans who just love their work. Like they'll do it in their spare time. Like if maybe they have to work in a factory during the day, but over the weekend they'll go to the garage and build a car or something like that, because it's the kind of thing they want to do. And I think almost all work can be like that. Now, of course, in any society, there's going to be some kind of work that just has to be done and nobody wants to do it. I don't know, maybe garbage collecting or washing the dishes okay, that kind of work gets just divided up in a decent society. But it leaves plenty of opportunity for work, the concept of work to be redesigned so that it's the sort of thing that people don't have to be driven to, but they'd have to be prevented from doing somehow because it's fulfilling and satisfying. Those are two quite different conceptions. And then if you really try to work it out, a lot of complexities arise. So for example, take say the Paracon literature, participatory economics. All right, they've tried to work out in some detail the way a society might be designed so as to be kind of guided by the Enlightenment ideal, but dealing with what they consider practical realities. Okay, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but that's the kind of question that ought to be asked and the kind of answers that people ought to try to give. And but fundamentally, it's back to just different conceptions of what work is and what human beings are. I mean, are they kind of, in their nature, dependent couch potatoes, or are they people who want to become involved in a creative, exciting, challenging work that they control themselves and cooperatively with others? Again, if you walk down the halls, you see students talking to each other. A lot of the work that gets done is cooperative work. It's the way things happen in almost anywhere, house building, whatever it may be.
And I want to say we have